Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Keller, Texas, just before sunrise, October 13th, 2011. A gated lane sits lit but still. By mid-morning, the quiet gives way to contradictions. A husband, Greg Williams, found unresponsive in bed. A house locked end to end. An explanation that shifts faster than the evidence can keep up. In neighborhoods like this, crime is often loudest in what's missing. Patrol units reach the address within minutes of the pre-dawn 911 dispatch. They split tasks cleanly. One team secures the perimeter, another contains the primary bedroom, a third documents initial statements. From the driveway inward, doors are closed and latched. Frames show no pry marks. Window locks register intact. Valuables are in plain sight. Electronics, handbags, a watch on a nightstand. Nothing looks rifled. Inside the primary bedroom, officers halt at the threshold long enough to fix the first frame of record. The layout is found. A firearm is visible near the bed. The room reads orderly rather than ransacked. Clothes hung, drawers closed, nightstand items aligned. They hold the scene and call in crime scene services. The discovery is noted once clinically, so the paperwork, not the retelling, can carry it forward. From the hall to the kitchen, the same pattern repeats. Surfaces unbothered, no scrape residue, no splintered trim. Even before photographs begin, a phrase starts to assemble in the officer's shorthand. Negative indicators. No forced entry. No alarm event. No obvious removal of property. The house tells a story of access, not assault. Statements are captured in quiet tones. The reporting spouse recounts a masked intruder and a blow with a wrench. The claim is recorded as given, time-stamped, and set aside for corroboration. While medics complete their protocols and step off the scene, a sergeant authorizes the first limited walkthrough. Camera flashes mark corners, door hardware, the line from hall to bed. Evidence tags open in numerical order. Nothing is pulled yet, only fixed in sequence so later steps can be audited. The first pass ends with a simple observation that will matter later. For a supposed home invasion, nothing from the entry points to the bedroom suggests a stranger fought through this space. The team does not say what happened. They say what they can see, what they can't, and what they will test. Later that morning, the narrative shifts. During a follow-up interview in the controlled space of the living room, the reporting spouse pivots toward suicide. Investigators do not argue the point. They log the change and flag it for comparison against the physical record. A pivot that large that fast is not a conclusion. It is a data point subject to the same scrutiny as a smudge on a doorknob. Supervisors tighten the inner perimeter. Foot traffic is limited to a short list, each entry signed and time-stamped. Technicians begin a measured sweep of the primary bedroom. Bedding position, mattress compression, the relationship of the firearm to the dominant hand the victim was known to use, distances from muzzle to textile recorded for later correlation with medical findings. They sample for transfer where it's procedurally sound to do so, careful not to contaminate what the medical examiner will need. Phones go under a lighter touch this early, no phishing, only preservation orders, and a quick preservation of call screens if lawfully visible. In cases rooted in 2011, investigators know what the era can deliver and what it cannot. There will be call records and cell site usage to reconstruct the night. There will not be a seamless GPS trail or app telemetry that didn't exist in common use. That discipline, staying inside what the year can prove, keeps the case from outrunning itself. Neighbors are contacted in a tight radius. Some heard nothing unusual. A few recall porch lights that stayed on. No one reports strangers lingering, vehicles idling, or glass breaking. The absence of sound does not answer the question, but it narrows the universe of plausible entries into a locked home. Before noon, the chain of custody starts to lengthen. Seals are affixed. The firearm is packaged for lab work. The bedding is logged for later correlation with muzzle to textile findings. Swabs are labeled. The goal is not volume, but integrity. Fewer items, better documented. Make a cleaner line from bedroom to courtroom. Across those hours, a theme sharpens. The physical record resists the idea of a forced entry and resists the idea of chaos. That leaves investigators with a quiet house, a deceased husband, and two versions of events recorded within hours of each other. In towns like this, the silence is not neutral, it leans. To the viewer, you've seen enough cases to know that silence can be staged and it can also be real. The question is which one you're looking at. If you lived 3 doors down, what detail would you want investigators to prioritize first? The locked hardware, the phone activity, or the sudden change in story? By afternoon, the decision is made to move from room control to body control. The scene will hold under seal. The next necessary voice is the medical examiner's. The body becomes the scene. Chain of custody, then forensic distance, then manner of death. The scene at the house was sealed. From this point forward, the body itself became the central piece of evidence. In every homicide investigation, custody begins not just with objects, but with the body. That was the case here. At the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's office, the transfer followed protocol. Deputies and crime scene officers signed off on each package. The firearm, recovered beside the bed, was handed over separately to the crime lab. Bags containing clothing, bedding sections, and swabs were checked for intact seals. Every movement was witnessed, timed, and photographed. Breaks in chain of custody can weaken entire prosecutions, so the formality is more than red tape. It is what preserves a case in court. The body of Greg Williams was received under property receipt, tagged with identifiers, and logged for autopsy. Intake began with external documentation. Clothing was described, hands were still bagged to preserve trace material, and position as received was photographed. No speculation, no narrative, just measurable details. Photographs focused on the wound location, skin around the entry point, and any visible stippling or soot. This stage answers the first critical question. Does the injury look like a contact wound, a near contact, or a distance shot? That distinction often guides the rest of the analysis. Internal examination followed radiographs. Pathologists tracked the bullet's course, documented tissue disruption, and recovered the projectile for comparison. Trajectory relative to anatomical planes was carefully recorded. Findings suggested muzzle-to-skin distance that was not typical for self-inflicted wounds in the posture alleged. The medical examiner stopped short of naming motive or person but did make a clear call. Cause of death, gunshot wound, manner of death, homicide. From there, sampling expanded. Swabs from Greg's hands and fingernails were processed for gunshot residue. GSR testing always comes with caveats. Presence can mean firing, being near a fired weapon, or secondary transfer. Absence does not prove a person did not fire. Still, it remains a standard part of the file. Toxicology samples, blood, vitreous fluid, and urine, were drawn and sealed. Panels would later test for alcohol, prescription medications, and other substances that could inform state of mind or impairment. Each sample went into evidence with bar-coded labels, every seal logged and photographed. Meanwhile, clothing and bedding were packaged for trace and residue testing. Analysts would later examine fiber transfer and residue patterns against known standards. The projectile recovered was handed to the ballistics section, which would determine caliber consistency, rifling marks, and whether the weapon collected at the house matched the shot that ended Greg's life. Every piece would connect back to the locked house, or fail to. Investigators offered the medical examiner a narrow set of scene facts. Locked doors, no pry marks, valuables untouched, firearm near the bed without editorializing. The ME compared those with the wound evidence and range indicators. The alignment was telling. In law enforcement, clean data can be both a strength and a problem. If everything aligns too neatly, investigators ask whether staging is in play. Here, the autopsy record made one fact unavoidable. This was not a suicide. Family notification and communication were handled with the same discipline. The medical examiner's office prepared statements that were precise, factual, and respectful, explaining findings without speculating. In towns like Keller, where violent deaths are rare, families depend on clarity. For many viewers, that is the human dimension. Behind every technical note is a family waiting for answers they may not want to hear. When the exam concluded, the room was cleared, photographs and notes were reviewed for internal consistency, and all samples were confirmed in the evidence system. The final report captured each finding with its limits spelled out. No leaps, no guesses, just the reproducible data. By the time the body was released to funeral services, the classification of homicide was secured. That single word carried the case forward. For investigators, the question now was not if a crime occurred, but how it was committed and who had opportunity. In a house locked from the inside, without signs of forced entry, the pool of possibilities narrowed dramatically. That pressure shifted the focus toward the data sets that don't change after the fact: phone records, cell site activity, and financial obligations. For you listening, with homicide established in a residence sealed tight and calm, which dataset would you consider most reliable for the next step? The silence of the phone logs, the cell tower hits, or the trail of insurance and financial papers? The focus moves from the body to the numbers, digital and financial records that test the story against data that cannot be altered after the fact. With the homicide classification entered, investigators shifted their attention from the body to the numbers. The autopsy had narrowed the possibilities, but it did not explain how the sequence unfolded inside a locked home. For that, they turned to the records that do not bend with memory: phone logs, cell site activity, and financial documents. The victim, Greg Williams, was a man with regular patterns. Friends described him as consistent with calls, texts, and check-ins. When detectives subpoenaed his phone records, those patterns suddenly ended. Within minutes of the estimated time of death, Greg's call history flatlined. There were no outgoing calls, no late-night texts, no accidental dials. The silence itself became data. Negative evidence, what wasn't there, often carries the same weight as a fingerprint. Cell site records confirmed what the perimeter already suggested. No device had left the Keller residence during the critical window. That eliminated theories of a fleeing intruder carrying a phone, and it supported the physical evidence of locked doors and intact entries. These technical records, limited to tower connections in 2011, were reliable snapshots. They didn't tell a story of movement across town, but they confirmed stillness in a house where violence had occurred. Investigators also checked for late-night activity on nearby devices. A sweep of tower hits in the area yielded nothing unusual. No spike in calls, no unidentified handset bouncing off the same sector at the same time. It is a small but important finding: the absence of corroborating outsiders. Again, negative evidence tightening the circle. Parallel to digital analysis came the financial review. Detectives pulled banking and insurance files. It was here that another layer emerged. Policies had been written naming Michele Williams and her daughter as beneficiaries. Combined coverage approached $750,000. Premium payments were current. Paperwork confirmed clauses that would activate in the event of Greg's death. These details did not prove action, but they established motive lines for prosecutors to examine. Working theories must remain disciplined. Investigators did not claim the policies caused the crime, only that they were a relevant context. They paired this with the sudden shifts in story, from masked intruder to suicide, both given within hours of discovery. When statements change that quickly and financial stakes are high, the contrast stands out. Detectives also examined banking activity. No large withdrawals, no missing funds, no unexplained transfers from Greg's accounts in the days leading up to his death. Instead, they found the steady rhythm of bill payments and normal household expenses. It suggested he was not planning to disappear, not preparing to abandon obligations. Stability in finances contradicted claims of despair or intent to end his own life. By late afternoon, analysts compiled the timeline: autopsy set homicide, phone silent after the key window, no external devices tied to the house, and policies that would benefit survivors. It is not proof of guilt, but it is a pattern building toward a prosecutable file. In major crimes, patterns often speak as loudly as confessions. Forensic examiners noted another detail from the digital side. While Greg's device went silent, Michele's showed activity in the early morning hours. A text here, a missed call there, captured in the carrier logs. The contrast, one phone gone dark, the other still alive, became another data point in the working matrix. Investigators paused to consider the human dimension. Financial pressure, sudden silence on a victim's phone, and a locked home are not just statistics. They reflect choices, moments where lives shift permanently. In towns like Keller, where violent death is rare, these shifts ripple outward through families, neighbors, entire communities. The numbers may seem cold, but they trace the lines of disruption that grief alone cannot explain. At this stage, detectives did not claim to know every answer, but they had cleared one path of speculation: no outsider, no break-in, no escape. The next step was to understand who Greg was, how he lived, and whether his life trajectory matched the claim of suicide. To those following along, when a homicide is set in a locked home and the financial record shows potential benefit for survivors, how heavily should that weigh compared to digital silence? Which evidence speaks more convincingly? the absence of phone activity, or the presence of insurance money. With data points aligned, the investigation shifted into victimology, mapping Greg Williams' life and character against the shifting explanations of his death. With the numbers stabilized, investigators turned to the person at the center of the file, Greg Williams. Victimology starts with routine. Detectives mapped Greg's week from verifiable sources: work schedules, emails, calendar notes, and regular calls to family. Supervisors at his workplace confirmed expected attendance later that week and an ongoing project with specific deadlines. Co-workers reported nothing unusual about his tone or behavior in the days prior. Friends described set habits, answering texts, returning calls, and weekend plans that were already on the calendar. Those items were not opinions, they were time-stamped entries and third-party confirmations. When a suicide claim is raised, this baseline matters. Sudden self-harm without let-up signals is less likely when obligations are current and routine is intact. Detectives then compared that baseline to the morning's shifting explanation. The intruder story, recorded within minutes of patrol arrival, was the first entry in the statement log. Hours later, the shift to suicide was recorded in a second interview. Victimology doesn't weigh those claims by volume. It tests them against behavior. Greg's last confirmed communications showed routine patterns up to the estimated window of death and then silence. His calendar contained near-term obligations he had initiated. There were no calls to crisis lines, no messages of farewell, no attempt to put financial or personal affairs in order. The absence of these indicators did not conclusively disprove suicide, but in a locked residence with no forced entry and a medical examiner's homicide classification, the probability line moved. Family contact provided another anchor. Interviews documented regular check-ins with relatives, including plans to meet later in the week. Detectives correlated those interviews with phone records to avoid memory gaps. Where a relative stated a routine call, the carrier logs typically showed it. Consistency between witness memory and machine records raised confidence. That cross-check, memory to logs, protected the narrative from drifting into speculation. Investigators also requested records from Greg's primary care provider to look for documented mental health crises or prescriptions that might suggest acute risk factors. They weren't fishing. They were closing reasonable doors. The records did not cite recent suicidal ideation or emergent psychiatric interventions. Toxicology results were still pending, but nothing in his medical history suggested a new trigger. On the practical side of life, his finances were orderly. Bills were current. There were no last-minute withdrawals or cash movements that would have hinted at abrupt plans to abandon obligations. The financial rhythm aligned with the work rhythm: stable, predictable, planned. Detectives flagged one small irregularity, an automatic payment rescheduled by a day, but the bank dated the change to a standard processing shift, not a client instruction. Little items like that can spiral into myths online. Here it was nothing. Neighbors helped define the social context. In a limited canvas, residents described Greg as polite and easy to place. Morning departures, evening returns, a consistent pattern visible to people who weren't watching for it. No one reported escalating conflict audible through walls or late-night arguments in the week before the shooting. Silence on that front is not proof of harmony, but it removes a common precipitating indicator for self-harm or explosive violence. With this composite, command staff authorized escalation from a suspicious death to a homicide assignment at the major crimes level. That shift wasn't cosmetic. It opened interagency coordination, digital forensics queued with the regional lab, expedited ballistics, and prosecutorial consults on subpoenas. The district attorney's office joined weekly case conferences to ensure that every next step, warrants for cloud accounts, deeper carrier records, financial subpoenas, met the standard for courtroom admissibility. In methodical jurisdictions, that early DA involvement keeps investigations from outrunning the rules of evidence. While the homicide team advanced, the interview track continued. Friends and coworkers were asked the same questions in different sessions to test consistency. Did Greg express intent to harm himself? Did he give away possessions or write goodbyes? Had he recently changed life insurance beneficiaries, retirement allocations, or wills? The answers were consistent across sources. No goodbyes, no sudden divestments, no unstable behavior. Again, none of this proved how the shot occurred, but it placed weight on a single side of the scale. One interview produced a forward-looking detail. Greg had made concrete plans involving work and family later that week, plans that required his presence. Detectives cross-checked the dates on his phone calendar and emails to confirm that he, not someone else, had initiated them. The result was a tightly framed picture. A man with near-term obligations, routine communications, no documented mental break, and no outward disengagement from his life. Investigators then examined household access. In a locked residence with no forced entry, who had keys, garage remotes, or alarm codes? The list was finite. Each person on it was tracked against call records and possible presence during the critical window. Victimology intersects with access control here. Who could enter without visible disturbance and who had reason to be there? This was not about declaring guilt in narration. It was about narrowing opportunity using objective criteria. The autopsy's range findings guided a focused re-examination of the bedroom textiles. Analysts correlated muzzle-to-textile expectations with the bedding sections seized in Chapter 2. The goal was to see whether residue patterns supported a self-inflicted angle from the position the suicide claim implied. Early lab notes did not align with that scenario. Those notes were kept internal until formal reports were complete, but they directed investigative energy. Prioritize interviews and records for those with access over continued canvass for unknown intruders. Prosecutorial consults began to sketch a theory that could be charged later if the developing pattern held. That theory would require 4 planks: medical examiner's homicide call, no forced entry at the residence, digital activity showing a local event and a silent victim line, and a financial context that made death beneficial to someone in the household. Victimology was the stabilizer for those planks, because if Greg's life trajectory supported continuity, it weakened alternative explanations that depended on sudden self-termination. Throughout this process, the tone with family remained measured. People deserve more than a line in a report. Greg Williams was not an abstraction. He had routines, responsibilities, and people counting on him. True crime audiences sometimes hear clinical detail and forget that. The point of victimology is not to humanize for drama. It is to describe the person accurately so the legal system doesn't erase who they were. With escalation logged and interagency tracks active, leadership set an investigative cadence. Weekly evidence reviews, standing calls with the DA, and disciplined messaging to avoid contaminating witness recollections. The working objective was simple: replace assumptions with replicable findings. That discipline protects both the living and the dead. A final note on retention for those watching closely. When a locked, orderly residence, a homicide manner of death, and a stable victim baseline converge, investigators focus on access, proximity, and benefit. It isn't sensational, it's method, and method is how crime stories become criminal cases. With baseline and access constraints established, prosecutors begin assembling a charging theory that can withstand cross-examination. By the time the autopsy confirmed Greg Williams's death as homicide, investigators and prosecutors began shaping a narrative they could stand behind in court. They worked from 4 anchors: the medical examiner's trajectory findings, the integrity of the locked residence, digital silence from Greg's phone, and the financial backdrop tied to life insurance. No single piece answered every question, but together they closed off alternatives that had been floated in the hours after the shooting. The medical report showed the wound path could not be reconciled with a self-inflicted shot. The home displayed no forced entry, no valuables taken, and a firearm staged in a way that conflicted with muzzle-to-fabric expectations. Carrier records added another line. Greg's handset stopped registering activity within minutes of the estimated time of death, while household devices stayed local. On the financial side, documents confirmed coverage that paid out only under certain conditions. These points narrowed the field dramatically. Attention then turned to post-incident behavior. Detectives had logged shifting explanations, first an armed intruder, later a suicide. Prosecutors reviewed when those statements were made and how they compared to available facts. The suicide claim surfaced before the autopsy's homicide finding, suggesting anticipation, not reaction. That sequence carried weight when prosecutors considered whether a jury would see it as inconsistent or as a sign of foreknowledge. The theory also incorporated staging concerns. Reports of a wrench attack were unsupported by physical evidence. The gun's placement looked deliberate. Ballistics at that stage were preliminary, but caliber checks and chamber cycling indicated compatibility with the fatal round. A full comparison would follow, but probable cause did not require finality. It required consistency strong enough to convince a grand jury. Prosecutors planned their presentation carefully. Jurors would hear first from the medical examiner, then the crime scene team on entry integrity, digital analysts on call records, and finally financial custodians explaining insurance structures. Lead investigators would close with the timeline of statements. Each witness covered one lane, avoiding overlap, building a sequence that jurors could follow without confusion. The grand jury returned a true bill for murder and evidence tampering. Bond restrictions underscored the seriousness of the charges. No contact with witnesses, limited travel, and surrender of passports. Prosecutors emphasized that this was not speculation. It was a homicide inside a locked home with evidence pointing inward, not outward. Pre-trial, the strategy was refined. Jurors would be walked through method first, motive second, how the shot occurred, why staging failed, and what the phones revealed, before any mention of financial gain. In American trials, physical sequencing often carries more weight than motive, and the state intended to lead with what could be measured. Behind the scenes, investigators tightened details. Lock photos were cataloged, carrier logs highlighted the last outbound call, and financial custodians authenticated every figure. The aim was to reduce openings for defense challenges. Trials are not won by overwhelming volume, but by presenting facts that hold under pressure. At its core, this charging phase showed how crime cases move from suspicion to courtroom. Medical science, digital footprints, and financial records converged with shifting explanations, creating a coherent frame that a jury could evaluate. It was no longer about possibilities, it was about what could be proven. With indictment secured, the focus turns to the courtroom, how those pillars will be tested in open trial. The charging theory moved from whiteboard to witness stand. Jurors first heard from the Tarrant County medical examiner. The pathologist kept to reproducible facts, entry wound orientation, internal track, and distance indicators documented during autopsy. Photographs were scaled, measurements were precise. The opinion was direct, homicide, supported by muzzle-to-skin characteristics and a trajectory that did not align with a self-inflicted shot from the posture claimed later that morning. On cross, the defense pressed the limits of distance estimates and the general caveats attached to gunshot residue. The doctor agreed on limits but held on the conclusion: manner, homicide, cause, gunshot wound. A senior crime scene technician followed. Jurors were shown a diagram of the primary bedroom and entry hardware photographs. The testimony focused on quiet anomalies: all entry points secured, no price signatures on frames, valuables undisturbed, and a firearm recovered near the bed that would later go to ballistics. The technician explained collection protocols and chain of custody, reinforcing that scene integrity allowed reliable comparisons with lab outcomes. Cross-examination aimed at contamination theories and the possibility of an intruder leaving minimal trace. The witness answered within training. The team looked for those artifacts and found none. Digital analysis came next. A carrier records specialist walked the panel through call detail printouts and cell site summaries. Greg Williams's handset activity ceased within minutes of the estimated time of death. There was no outbound activity later that night. Household devices remained local on sector hits. No outside handset was identified using the same sector at the critical window in a way that matched a flight from the residence. The analyst cautioned jurors about the limits of 2011-era records: no GPS, no app telemetry, then emphasized what the records could prove: silence on one phone, locality on others, and no corroboration for an intruder narrative. Financial custodians testified to life insurance structures, coverage amounts, beneficiaries, including Michele Williams, and payout conditions. Policies were current. Prosecutors didn't argue motive through witnesses. They laid out documents and clauses. On cross, the defense emphasized that insurance exists in many households and does not prove intent. The custodian agreed. The documents simply confirmed potential benefits triggered by death. Lead investigators then presented a timeline overlay matching statements to verifiable checkpoints. Jurors saw how the first account reported a masked intruder and a blow with a wrench, and how later that morning the report pivoted to suicide, both recorded before the autopsy's homicide call. Investigators did not characterize the changes as lies. They presented them as data points compared against scene conditions and medical findings. On cross, the defense suggested stress and shock can distort memory. The investigator agreed in principle and returned to the physical record. Absence of forced entry, controlled interior, and a shot that did not fit a self-inflicted profile. Ballistics testimony was staged carefully. A firearms examiner described class characteristics consistent between the recovered projectile and the household firearm, then explained microscopic comparison procedures. The report addressed toolmark agreement within accepted terminology. The examiner also performed functional checks on the firearm's safety features and cycling. No sweeping claims were made, only what the microscope supported. Cross-examination highlighted the absence of perfect fingerprints and the general reality that some firearms yield mixed or partial DNA. The expert kept the lanes clear. Source attribution was based on comparative marks, not on print or DNA expectations jurors sometimes see on television. Gunshot residue and trace analysts appeared with cautionary language. A lab scientist told jurors what GSR can and cannot prove. Presence can result from firing, proximity, or secondary transfer. Absence does not exclude firing. The state did not lean on GSR to prove identity. It used it to round out range logic with the autopsy's distance evaluation. That restraint mattered. Jurors could see the prosecution relying on strong pillars and documenting the limits of weaker ones. The state closed its case in chief by returning to sequence, not sensational claims. The prosecutor summarized with 4 pillars and the overlay. The medical examiner's homicide finding. A secured interior resistant to an outsider theory. Digital records showing a silent victim phone and no corroborating external device. And a financial backdrop establishing potential benefit. Layered over all of it was the evolving explanation captured in signed statements. First an intruder, then suicide. Before the medical call. The message was not that life insurance equals guilt, or that silence alone convicts. It was that the crime was mapped by converging, testable facts that pointed inward. For a community watching, this part of trial is often the most technical and the most important. It shows whether promises made in pretrial meetings hold up under oath. In this courtroom, the state stayed inside admissible boundaries. No speculative motive lectures, no untested lab leaps, and no rehash of discovery details introduced earlier. Each witness added a discrete layer. Jurors now had the pillars. What they lacked was the defense's alternative. How a suicide could reconcile with trajectory. How an intruder could bypass secured entries, or how outside presence could exist without a single corroborating record. The defense answers, offering alternative explanations, attacking methodology, and asking jurors to find reasonable doubt before deliberations and verdict. When the state rested, the defense pushed uncertainty. They highlighted the limits of distance analysis, the possibility of residue transfer, and the lack of a single smoking gun. Experts spoke on the broad margins of gunshot science and cell site data, but under cross they conceded, nothing in this file pointed to an intruder. Character witnesses added sympathy but not proof. A consultant suggested rare, clean entry scenarios, yet the intact locks and absence of tool marks weighed heavier. The defense's digital expert reminded jurors the 2011 records lacked GPS precision, but no outsider phone aligned with the timeline. The judge instructed carefully. Guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Circumstantial evidence was valid, and shifting statements could be weighed. In closings, the state focused on sequence, autopsy, secured scene, silent phone, financial context, while the defense leaned on possibilities, not certainties. Deliberations centered on exhibits, autopsy notes, bedroom diagrams, call logs. Hours later, the jury returned. Guilty of murder, sentence 60 years. The ruling was clear, single, and final. Appeals and aftermath, how the verdict held up on review. The trial concluded with a decisive outcome. Jurors found Michele Williams guilty of murdering her husband, Greg Williams, in their Keller, Texas home. Prosecutors showed a staged burglary, a secured entry, silent phone records, and financial stress. Forensic experts confirmed Greg's death was not accidental. On appeal, defense arguments failed. The conviction and 60-year sentence were affirmed. No new evidence shifted the record. The judgment stood. Michele remains incarcerated, parole eligibility determined by statute. For Greg's family, justice did not erase grief but provided certainty. Law enforcement closed the file methodically, archiving evidence for future reference. The case is now used in training, illustrating how precise, verifiable details can prove a crime even without dramatic scenes. This crime reminds us, justice depends on accuracy, not spectacle. Greg Williams is remembered, and the record is clear. His life ended by a staged story, uncovered through steady investigation. Michele Williams is serving a 60-year prison term in Texas for the murder of her husband, Greg Williams. The crime remains a stark reminder of how truth, once proven, endures. Looking back on Greg Williams' story, I can't help but think how fragile trust can be when it's broken from within. This crime was not only about one man's death, it was about how deception corrodes families and how justice, even when delayed, still matters. As someone sharing this case with you, I want to leave one thought. Learn to recognize the quiet warning signs around you and never ignore them. What do you think we as a community can do to prevent tragedies like this? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from, or share what stood out to you most. And if this story spoke to you, even in a difficult way, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next case we uncover together.